Dating and hooking up in the Victorian era was weird. They even had books with instructions on how to rightfully date. The 19th century was a social activity in which love took on greater prominence rather than only seeking marriage for economic and social benefit. The society had laid down some stringent rules for courting, and these had to be followed. Welcome back to History Rediscovered. To support, please subscribe. On this episode, we discuss what hooking up and dating was like in the Victorian era. Furthermore, we will also look at their weird dating customs. Victorians believed touching yourself could drive men and women insane. Many people in Victorian times thought that excessive disease and physical ills were caused by self-pleasures. According to the majority of scientists, masturbating frequently leads to insanity. Subsequently, a range of illnesses and disorders were linked to the negative effects of self-indulgence. Moreover, it was assumed that those who were pale, obese, or unhealthy thin were all habitual masturbators. They go so far as to invest in cornflakes to try and curb the urge to indulge oneself. When it comes to reducing libidinous energy, cornflakes, not just any brand, but Kellogg's cornflakes in particular, were a must-eat food. In fact, John Harvey Kellogg himself called his renowned nutritious breakfast cereal a healthy, ready-to-eat anti-masturbatory morning meal, implying that it was proper for any well-bred gentleman to be seen eating it. The idea was that lewd meals produced lewd habits. You might be wondering what exactly a lascivious food is. In general, anything hot or very rich or flavored, thick French sauces, and maybe Bloody Marys, had they been invented at that point, were off limits. Equally troubling was Kellogg's instruction to young girls to burn out their desire by dousing their clitorises in carbolic acid. No intimacy before marriage. It looked bad for a woman to court a man. Victoria was the exception to this rule, even though she was the one who really asked Albert to marry her. A woman's decision to make the first move during courtship was seen negatively back then. A Victorian woman was not ever allowed to go out and meet a man on her own. She was constantly escorted by an elderly person, so the girl had to get her mother's approval before leaving the house. So, when the couples met, some form of supervision was provided. If a woman was alone, she could not host a guy in her residence. There has to be another family member in the room. There was no physical contact between the woman and the gentleman until marriage. Victorian etiquette for men courting dictated that a man could offer the girl his hand if the road was uneven. That was the only touch which was accepted between a man and a woman. Having children out of wedlock was stigmatized. Although while the number of illegitimate births was relatively limited throughout the Victorian era, when they did occur, it was widely prohibited. Because they became pregnant outside of marriage, fictional figures like Hetty Sorrel and Fanny Robin helped to perpetuate the stereotype of single moms as tragic, damaged women. Many times, single moms would leave their newborn children at the entrance to hospitals because they were so afraid of being shunned. In the worst situations, desperate mothers killed their infants. Prostitution freaked people out. While prostitution was once a legitimate career, it went against the social values that were prevalent in the Victorian era. It was considered improper to use prostitutes in a marriage between a man and a woman, because it was intended to be a union between just the two of them. It wasn't just about the sex either. Prostitutes stood for women's liberation from the patriarchal. Prostitutes had the social and financial independence that other women lacked since they were not bound to the family. As a result, fallen women were demonized in popular culture as prostitutes in an effort to shame them and deter young girls from taking the same road. Prostitutes were also shamed and punished if caught. Police were allowed to arrest prostitutes for having STDs. Despite the fact that society didn't normally support prostitutes, clients continued to request their services. Unprotected sexual encounters with prostitutes increased the prevalence of STIs, especially in the armed forces. The Contagious Diseases Acts, which allowed police to imprison women they believed to be prostitutes, were thus passed in 1864. The women were examined while they were in detention to see whether they had a STI, and if they did, they were transferred to a lock hospital for up to 9 months to prevent them from spreading any illnesses to men. These laws were passed, as was customary in Victorian society, to safeguard males rather than women. Be ready to act the night if a lady in your company is attacked. According to this strange passage from Beadle's dime book of Practical Etiquette for Ladies and Gentlemen, 1859, which addresses verbal attacks, chivalry was very much alive and well during the Victorian era. The advice, which is interesting, also discusses what to do if a woman in your organization is the one who initiated the conflict, if she cause offense, and that without reason. Your office is that of mediator. You should even beg forgiveness for your friend. Are you being advised to toss your girlfriend under the bus, or the Victorian equivalent, by this kind of? The counsel goes on to say that it is nonsensical to engage into a fight over the idea that the one being attacked has the right to be impudent. Hence, if your woman picks fights with men on the street without cause, please apologize on her behalf. Nevertheless, please refrain from taking the attacker's side too forcefully, as doing so will expose you as being as uneducated as he is. When traveling with a lady, always carry her bag. The Victorian era was Paul Ryan's favorite time period. When criticizing Donald Trump's infamous Access Hollywood tape in 2016, the Republican House Speaker stated that women are to be championed and revered, a sentiment that is very reminiscent of manners from the Victorian era. For your own sake, reverence woman wherever you find her, it will confirm you in the habits of a gentleman, and may be the means of winning you a genuine matrimonial prize. You know how winners usually get rewards. The Complete Bachelor, Etiquette for Men, 1896, advised, when traveling with a lady, always carry her bag and assist her in and out of trains. This was part of championing a Victorian woman. Travel brings out both the good and terrible aspects of a man, and his behavior is on its mettle under these conditions. Thus it is actually especially encouraged to do this. Homosexuality was illegal. Homosexuality, which had been taboo in earlier decades, became more prevalent in the latter years of the Victorian era. Other than public obscenity rules, which could be easily circumvented, there was no specific legal prohibition of the practice for a while. Nonetheless, all homosexual relationships, even those that occurred in private, became illegal in 1885. Oscar Wilde was imprisoned as a result of this act 11 years later. On the evening of April 28, 1870, Bolton and Park were spotted by a police detective as they left a house near Regent Square. The detective followed them to the Strand Theatre, where they entered a private box along with two more men. A police superintendent and a police sergeant joined the detective during the performance, before arresting Bolton and Park as they tried to leave the theatre. Shockingly, the men were subjected to examinations on their private parts by a police doctor in order to establish if they had intimate relations. They were brought before the magistrate at Bow Magistrates Court. Educating your kids about their parts was encouraged. Professionals in the Victorian era urged parents to teach their children about birds and bees, as well as the purpose of each of their parts. The broad consensus was that women should at the very least be aware of the fundamental principles of as well as the names of their own reproductive organs. Yet, their education should not be so narrowly focused that women would become curious and look into it on their own. In part, this was done to prevent girls from freaking out when they started their periods. Yet, only male youngsters received in-depth instruction on how it operated and where everything went. This had the unintended consequence of giving some young women a crash training in on their wedding night. Children were also urged to exercise as much as possible throughout the day by their parents, which left them too exhausted to even touch themselves when they went to bed.